Charlotte here again. How are you doing? Right, I wanted to talk a little bit about the paints that I'm going to use in my painting demonstrations, and I get asked a lot by students about which paints to buy, especially when you're on a limited budget. I mean, you know that phrase, paint like a millionaire, which I guess means value the work you're doing, use really good quality materials which will last, and you'll get the best results. And that's fantastic if you can afford to do that. But when you're experimenting as well with different techniques, different styles, sometimes it's just as good to use some cheaper materials. The key is working out which ones, because not all cheap paints are created equally. Now, for all the regular students in my classes, you'll recognise our three primary coloured bottles which are on all of the tables. And in my classes in New Zealand, I always provide the materials, the paints and the tools, so everybody is using the same. And it's really good to learn how to control and mix your colours using primaries. Now, these are all from the Derivan student acrylic paint series, which is made in Australia, but obviously available lots of places. One of the reasons why we use these, it's the strength of the pigments in particular in these primary colours, and that's what you need to look out for in your cheaper paints. Obviously, the expensive brands, one of the reasons why they're more expensive is that they have a much higher concentration of pigment. The pigments are better quality to start with, and you need to use less of them to get really strong, intense colours. But again, when I'm teaching, I want to make sure that the students aren't holding back with the way they want to try and paint, the thickness of the paint that they want to use. So I'm always going to be encouraging generous use of paints, especially with palette knife. And these Derivan paints are really good because they're very thick and creamy. The blue, that's a phthalo blue or phthalo blue, and this is a cool red, which is relatively close to cadmium red medium. Now, these Atelier brands are also really good, but they're a little bit more expensive, and you can go through quite a lot of that if you're doing really thick palette knife work. And again, that's another thing. In the classes, we use paint on its own. I don't really mix mediums in to create extra body, but that's something you can do, of course. If you want to get really thick textured paint, you can use all sorts of moulding paste to put over your canvas first and paint on top of, so you're not just using a thickness of paint. Now, I buy the paint in 2 litre bags because we go through a lot of it, and you will go through the most white and yellow usually. Now, the one problem with the Derivan yellow, really soupy, that's completely liquidy in there, and it's a shame because it's such a lovely colour, which is very close to the cadmium yellow medium. So sometimes students who are doing thicker work will use the Pebeo student acrylics, the high viscosity, which comes in some really good yellow tones. So if one of my students is doing really thick bodied work with yellows, we'll use some of that to work into it, and that could just be a little bit less frustrating than having to put on so much of this and mixing a lot of white in to give it the thickness that it needs. Now, when I mentioned earlier that all cheaper paints are not created equal, what you have to just be a little bit careful of, especially with the blues. Now, this phthalo blue from Derivan, it's got a really strong pigment, and you only need a little bit of it. Now, these Reeves acrylic fine artist quality, they say, they're actually nice, creamy, thick paints. But what you want to be careful of, if you're not confident with colour mixing, hopefully you can see between the three of those colours and this one, even through the jar. I mean, that's obviously the colour of it. Hopefully you can tell that for these two, they've added white in. So this one has got a little bit of white added in and a different mix of colours to get that, well, they call it cobalt, but for me it's more of a kind of periwinkle, slightly lilac-y blue. And this is more of it's like a sky blue colour. And you can probably tell that because they're light, they've got white added in, whereas this is a much stronger, closer to a primary blue without much additive. So if you're using either of these and you're mixing them in, you might get results that you're not expecting, because the white in these blue paints is going to make a huge difference, especially to red. So blue and red, when you're adding those together, if there's white in there, you're going to start getting some slightly purpley colours, but maybe more grey than you're anticipating. So it's always good to try and get strong, bright colours if you can. So go for your primary tones and experiment with mixing them, or do a colour mixing course where you're really understanding how to control the colours. I mean, in the studio here, we have hundreds and hundreds of ready mixed tubes of paint for the students to use, and almost all of them, 95%, will end up using the three primary colours plus white, which are on all of the tables, because my students having the confidence to control and mix the colours that they want. Now, we never use ready mixed black paint in my classes, because again, through those three, you can actually create a black substitute. And one of the most important aspects of colour is the context. So being able to mix colours which will look lighter or darker against one another is a really great skill to have. And black, you can make a really rich, controlled black by mixing it yourself rather than using out of a tube, which can sometimes be quite cold and dead and flat if you just use it on its own. Now, there are a couple of colours that usually appear on the tables if we're doing some really bright work. Some purples and violets are really hard to mix from just a very simple set of primary colours. And so the dioxazine purple, either the Atelier version, or I use a Winsor Newton artist's acrylic. That's an amazing purple. You just need a little bit of white into it to get a very vibrant yellow. There's quinacridone, or some of these names. Do you know how to pronounce them? I'd love to know, but I'm going to say quinacridone magenta. You'll be shouting at the film probably that it's not pronounced like that. So anyway, really good bright pink magenta is a good complement to using some of the red, and also a phthalo green, really deep dark green. Now, mixing the dark green with a purple, I mean, you get an incredibly dark, deep black looking colour, or even the magenta with the green. Those are excellent ways to make black. But I'm not really here to talk about colour mixing, but just to give you an idea of what you can do with a very simple number of paints. And that's also important, I think, when you're starting out or wanting to experiment, is not complicating what you're doing and using a limited number of colours to get effects and mixes which are going to look really, really good together. Now, when I'm doing my own work, especially if I'm working on a portrait or something which I know is going to have fewer layers of paint maybe than my very expressive, thick palette knife paintings, I will use the more expensive paints, the Winsor Newton Professional, the golden acrylics. I mean, they are extremely good paints, and you'll have your own favourites if you've experimented before. I use a lot of the golden fluid acrylics as well with some of my contemporary landscapes. But often I say, when people are starting out, think about building up your painting with the first layers. Absolutely fine to use cheaper paints as long as you're using ones which have good, strong pigmentation. And that's the key to making sure that you're not using too many of the ones which have white added in, that you're finding the ones which are really nice and rich and strong primary colours, and learning how to mix those yourself. and having a really good thick creamy white that's going to give a lot of coverage. And if you start with those cheaper layers, if you like, and then you can actually build up to getting more and more expensive the closer you get to the surface of the painting, and that's quite a good way as well. So the exterior layers of the painting are going to be with your more expensive brands, the higher quality pigments, but you're not going through tubes and tubes of it. And I think that can be a real danger when you're wanting to experiment, when you're wanting to have some freedom with your painting. And I mean, I've got a little bit beyond that now in my head, but there was times when I was starting out, and you know, I'd want to be squeezing out a lot of this and using it really thickly, and I'd be working on massive canvases, and there's part of you thinking, oh wow, right, there's $200 of paint there today, and it really can start to add up, and especially if the painting doesn't work in the way you want to, and you end up painting over it and starting again. I mean, you have to get beyond that, don't you? When you're wanting to create art, it's not about the amount of money that goes into the painting, but there's certainly an aspect of that which we all need to think about. So the paints that I use in class, I've spent years working out which are the really good ones to use and why. And there are probably about 30 colours available in this range, and I would only recommend 6 of them because many of them have got this sort of issue going on. They're mixed, obviously, because they're a cheaper quality, and you don't get the clean, bright results that you think you're going to get. But these 3, absolutely great, other than the liquidity of this yellow, which is a beautiful buttery colour, but just sometimes it's just not quite what you need. So don't worry about having cheaper paints, certainly not when you're starting out, and even if you've been painting for a while, there's no harm in using colours, using paints from the cheaper brands, especially when you're experimenting. But definitely think about having a few tubes in colours which are slightly harder to mix. The magentas, the purples, a really bright orange, and a very deep dark green is a good one to have as well if you're wanting to then mix a nice controlled black. I mean, this is an excellent orange, Perole orange. It's a beautiful, bright, almost a fluorescent orange, which gives a really, really lovely pinky tone when you mix it with white. I use that quite a lot in portraiture actually, but I do love a bit of orange in my painting, so that's a really, really good one. And you can't get bright oranges like that in the cheaper paints. So there's some tubes which are really worth having in more expensive, with the better pigments and more expensive brands, but for thickness, and absolutely just, you know, buy a cheaper white and use the paint with confidence without counting the dollars while you're doing it, because you want to be able to enjoy the whole process. Okay, so now for most of the painting exercises that I'm going to be demonstrating and the little workshop pieces, I'm going to be using the 3 primary colours and just adding in a touch of purple and pink for some of them, but it's mostly going to be mixed, and I'll be showing you how to create the colours that you need for all of those different exercises. Okay, so hopefully that helps, and just a little reminder just to be confident with what you've got and with what you want to do, and don't feel like you have to follow any particular methods or any particular brands when you're experimenting and when you're starting out, and definitely don't think that because you're using cheaper paints your work is going to be of a lesser value or a lesser quality. Okay, so just keep an eye out for the ready mixed blues in particular, and I make sure that you've got a couple of the more expensive ones on hand for getting different thicknesses and different brightnesses. Okay, now let's go and have some fun with paint.